Kia ora, welcome to Paws for Thought. This week we're meeting the founder of a wonderful animal rescue centre which takes in abused and injured animals. Shawn Bishop and her partner Michael Dixon 11 years ago set up the sanctuary at Matakana, north of Auckland. The first animals to join them there were donkeys, Solomon and Bartholomew. The couple has also rescued many battery hens who were in a terrible state. The hens, at 18 months of age, were at the end of their useful lives to battery farmers. We'll also talk this week about experiments on animals. Do hundreds of thousands of New Zealand animals really need to suffer each year in the name of science? What alternatives are there to these cruel practices? The Sanctuary. The footage you're seeing is of Shawn Bishop and Michael Dixon's Animal Rescue Centre north of Auckland. Donkeys Solomon and Bartholomew moved onto the property on the same day as Shawn and Michael. The sanctuary is 32 acres and has grazing and provides a permanent home for abused animals. The property is bordered by 400 acres of protected bush. This means that Shawn and Michael can safely release rehabilitated native birds. The animals you're seeing have been rescued and cared for at the sanctuary. Some will find a permanent home there. Others will receive treatment for injuries and recover before being released into the wild. There are around 100 animals at the sanctuary, two-legged and four-legged, native and exotic, warm-blooded and cold-blooded, all receiving the care they deserve. Shawn and Michael say that running the sanctuary is very hard work. One of their greatest rewards is seeing rehabilitated native birds soaring back into their natural lives in the wild. The permanent residents who have been badly treated by humans are at first fearful, but with love and good treatment become gentle and trusting. Shawn and Michael say that animals can teach us a lot about forgiveness and being able to love and trust again. Now, to talk more about the sanctuary, I'm joined by Shawn Bishop and Benji. Kia ora, welcome to the program, Shawn and Benji.
Thank you for inviting us.
Now, can you tell me what led you and your partner to decide to set up the sanctuary?
Yeah, we were both corporate people and led a city life, but I grew up in the country and kind of longed to get back to it. And my whole life I've wanted to help animals, and although we had a very good life, it felt like something was missing. There was something I was meant to do that I wasn't yet doing, and luckily I have an amazing husband who's very supportive, and we made the decision together to retire from corporate life and move to the country and open an animal sanctuary.
And I believe the first two four-legged friends to join you were two donkeys, is that right?
Actually, there was 3 donkeys.
Three?
Yes. They were donkeys that had not once but twice been abused and neglected. So they'd been rescued, and then their rescue situation was also neglectful, and they were in a very bad way. And they were rescued by the Donkey Welfare Trust, who then phoned us and said, "We've heard you're going to be opening a sanctuary. Is there any chance they could come?" And we weren't even ready yet, but we couldn't say no, so we went and met them, fell in love with them, and basically boarded them there until the day that we were ready to move onto the property. And the donkeys moved the same day we did and got there a few minutes before we did, so we often joke that they've been there longer than we have.
And so I guess you had to learn about donkey care quite quickly, or did you already know something about donkeys?
No, one of the challenges of running an animal sanctuary is that every species that you get, you go on a massive learning curve. I think it's a little bit like people do when they have their first child. You ask questions and you read books and you talk to other people and you look things up and you make mistakes and feel terrible and then get it right the next time. And every time we have a new species come to the sanctuary, we go on that learning curve all over again.
And what were the next animals to arrive after the donkeys?
Let's see, after the donkeys we had, the next one was a goat, a little baby goat, and that was just a wonderful, heartwarming experience. Baby goats are just so full of joy and love. And then kuni pigs, and we branched out from there.
Wow. And now you've got about 100 animals, haven't you?
Yeah, it varies depending on who's being adopted and who's been rescued, but we can average around 100 animals. We surprisingly don't specialize in dogs and cats because there are a lot of really wonderful organizations that already specialize in rescuing dogs and cats. And what we realized was there was a gap for some other types of animals that were actually really hard to place. And so we actually set up with the express purpose of filling that gap and providing a sanctuary, a haven, a refuge for abused and neglected, hard-to-place animals like farm animals.
So do most animals stay permanently with you, or some of them you can treat and get them to trust humans and get in a better state again and then they're rehomed, or?
Both. Ideally, originally my idea was that they would all come and have a wonderful permanent home with us, but we filled up pretty fast. Unfortunately, the word, got out there, well, fortunately, the word got out there, and there was so much need, and there are so few places like ours that in actual fact we were overwhelmed fairly quickly. And a friend of mine challenged me and said, I know you want to keep every animal that comes through, but you need to let some of them go. And that's when we began to start rehoming as well. So we rescue, we rehabilitate, and we also rehome.
And one of your specialties is native birds, isn't it?
It is. We have 3 areas that we specialize in at the sanctuary. So the first is these hard-to-place, abused and neglected animals that we talked about. The second is native birds, and we take injured adults and also orphaned babies, and we either rehabilitate them and release back to the wild, or we rear them and release to the wild. And the third area is battery hens. We rescue battery hens as they're about to be slaughtered, we rehabilitate them, and we rehome them.
And how did you get into the rescuing battery hen side of it?
At first, in the early days, I thought, well, we're a sanctuary, of course we'll provide a home for some rescued hens. I didn't expect to fall in love with them. I had no idea that they had so much personality, and we hear the term bird brain, and I thought they wouldn't be very smart. And the very first batch that arrived escaped, and they outsmarted me regularly. And I realized that in actual fact they're quite intelligent, and they have personalities, and they're curious, and they're interactive, and I totally fell in love with them. Then as I learned more about the plight of commercial hens, I became more and more outraged at the cruelty involved in that industry, and decided that we would do something to help. So we rescue hens at point of slaughter, which is only 18 months old. They've only laid for 1 season. People call them spent hens and think that that's the end, but in actual fact those hens will lay for years. Nobody wants to feed them for the 6 weeks that they're not laying before they start laying again, and that's when they're killed. So we rescue as many as we're allowed to take, and as many as we have room for. We rehabilitate them because they are in shocking state, and then we rehome them. And at this point, we have rehomed over 1,700 hens, because hens are the new black, and it's really becoming a popular thing. People don't want eggs that are associated with cruelty, and people are becoming really interested in having their own chooks in the backyard, just like we did in the old days, having their own fresh, cruelty-free eggs, and it's becoming very popular, so it's something we do a lot now. How did you work out how to care for hens who'd been just so badly treated all their lives? Well, of course, their lives are fairly short at that point. They're only 18 months old, or the free-range hens are only 15 months old, because ironically, because they've been allowed to display some natural behaviors, they actually go off lay earlier, so they're actually killed earlier. And so I have a wonderful vet who taught me a lot. I've worked a lot with Sylvia Durant, the bird lady from Rothsay Bay. She's taught me a lot, and working with other people who have had experience before we started. And we've worked out a lot of our own routines and ways of doing things, and now it seems like second nature. And people need to be careful, because even if they want to avoid buying eggs that have been raised in battery cages, often it's actually quite hard for people to tell. And also I think you've got some concerns about so-called free-range eggs. I think that whenever you intensively farm animals, you're going to find poor welfare. A free-range, we rescue both. We work with a couple of farms, and we're allowed to rescue some free-range hens. sometimes people come onto the sanctuary and they see those hens that have just been rescued and they burst into tears and they say, "Oh, those poor battery hens, that's why I never buy battery eggs." And I say, actually those are free-range hens, and they're shocked because they don't look any different. It's because there's 7,000 of them in a barn, and although we think free range, we picture a tree and 1 or 2 hens, in actual fact, by law, you're allowed to have 10 hens per square meter. Well, that's packed. That is absolutely jam-packed. And if you have 7,000 hens like that, the stress and the intensity of having that many hens jammed into that space still results in pecking and fighting and deaths, and they have wounds and their feathers are pulled out, and it's still pretty brutal.
Yeah. If people want to help you and the sanctuary, what's the best thing they can do? Donate money, volunteer their time? What do you need at the sanctuary?
All of the above. We are completely volunteer run and we are completely self-funded, so we do rely on donations for food and veterinary care and medicine and things like that. Petrol vouchers, because we drive hundreds of kilometers for rescues and rehomings. If you win Lotto on Saturday night, think of us. We desperately need an animal float and a good second-hand vehicle to pull it. And we'd love to expand even, but all of that takes money, so we do what we can, and yeah, we appreciate any help that we can get.
And so you're thinking about expanding if you can get additional funds?
I would love to. If I win Lotto on Saturday night, we'll definitely be expanding. I mean, the need is so large. We get so many calls. And we really struggle to provide the services. We are just volunteers, and yet we work 30 hours a day. So it is a struggle, and I would love, if I had more land, if I had more grazing, then I could rescue more animals. And we even have land adjacent to us that has been offered for our use, if we could put up a barn and we could put up fences and we could put in water troughs. So we raise money and do a project, and then we raise money and do the next project, and we'll expand that way.
Thanks a lot, Shawn, to you and Benji, and good luck with that Lotto win.
Thank you so much.
More than 327,000 animals were used in experiments in New Zealand in 2011. These included 978 cats, 39 of whom suffered high impact as a result. More than 20,000 fish were used, with 3,128 suffering very high impact. 70,687 mice were subjected to these practices. And other animals who suffered very high impacts included guinea pigs, rats, pigs and sheep. More than 1,000 dogs were used in experiments. Over the past 5 years, the number of animals exploited in this way has been rising rather than falling. Prior to that, the number of animals used had peaked in 1994 before dropping to 160,000 in 1995. When the number increased to 325,000 in 2001, it was reported as skyrocketing. But the 2001 figure was actually lower than the 2011 figure. Now, to talk more about vivisection, I'm joined by Stephen Manson of the New Zealand Anti-Vivisection Society. Kia ora, Stephen, welcome to the program.
Yeah, hi, good to be here.
What animals are used in experiments in New Zealand?
There's a whole range of animals used in New Zealand, ranging from agricultural animals like cattle, sheep, chickens, deer, to other animals like mice, rats, other rodents. Marine mammals are used, cats, dogs, you name it pretty much. They're used here in some way.
And how many animals are used in experiments each year?
The number fluctuates each year, but on average it's around just under 300,000 per year, and that's the average that's been pretty constant for the last couple of decades since the numbers have been kept well.
That's an awful lot of animals, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And what pain do the animals suffer?
It varies from the different experiments. Some of the more extreme end is a little testing of traps for possums and other wildlife, to some of the other more in the medical research area. The Ponnuki test has been done here. That's one they do on dogs. They'll cut the dog's legs open, sever tendons, and just let them heal badly, and that's a model for arthritis, and they try and test arthritis drugs on the dogs that have had that done to them.
And how many animals die in experiments?
On average, over the total that's used each year, it's about 40%, so around 120,000, but that differs a lot from the species. For the agricultural animals, it's very small percentages, anywhere from about 3 to 7% are dead at the end of the experiments. For rats, mice and rabbits, virtually all of them are killed by the end of the test, either during the experiment or at the conclusion of it.
And what sorts of experiments are animals used in?
A lot of the majority is agricultural work aimed at increasing productivity for the meat industry and the dairy industry in New Zealand. But there is medical research being done in New Zealand, product safety testing's done here, and there's quite a range of testing for that.
And what sort of product safety testing would that be?
The arthritis drugs I just mentioned, that was done here. It's kind of hard to say, as trying to get the details of the experiments that's done out of the people doing it is very hard.
Because it's kept reasonably secret, really, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got to rely on papers that have been published in scientific journals. For a lot of the product development stuff, because that's contract work that's done by private companies, that's not, the results aren't published. Ministry of Primary Industries, they require everyone who uses animals in research, testing and teaching to file with them what species and what numbers are used each year, but they don't like releasing the details of that data. We've been struggling for some time to get that information under the Official Information Act, and we've sort of ground to a halt while the Ombudsman is assessing it at the moment.
Because members of the public would be pretty horrified if we knew exactly what animals were experimented on and how much pain they suffered.
Yeah, I believe they would. A lot of this just goes under the radar. People aren't really aware of it. Typical response is people are shocked it even happens in New Zealand, but it happens every day. And
on cats and dogs and all, really, as you said before, a really wide range of animals?
Yeah, definitely. And the dogs have been high profile in the last few years with the Valley Animal Research Centre shutting down. That's received a lot of coverage. But yeah, it goes on.
And do we need to test products on animals?
No, we don't. We don't need to be testing them. There's a lot of other better, more modern ways of testing these drugs now. Rat and rodent trials typically give about 40% accuracy rate, 40 to 60% accuracy rate for predicting what the drugs are going to do when they're applied to humans.
So that doesn't seem terribly accurate.
You might as well flip a coin, really.
Yeah.
You look doing some of the more modern tests that are using cell cultures of human cells, and you're hitting 80 to 90%, predicting what's going to happen when it hits humans. You're never going to get a test that's 100%, but the jump from 40 to 60 to 80 to 90 is pretty self-evident.
Yeah, that's pretty massive.
Yeah, and a lot of these are now standard tests used by the pharmaceutical industry overseas, and I've seen the change from 40% of drugs failing when they hit the human trial stage to only 10% failing when they hit the human trial stage, because the preclinical trials are a lot better now because I've stopped using animal testing for a lot of this.
And what other alternatives are there to animal testing?
For every type of test, there'll be multiple alternatives. It's such a complex issue that it's kind of hard to go, oh, here's an alternative, because for every type of test there will be alternatives. But a lot of the research we've been doing recently has been in toxicology testing and how that's done. And there's various tests that use cultured human cells. They uptake a red dye, and when the cells die, they drop the red dye. So they just expose the cell cultures to the drugs, and then you can just visibly tell from looking at them how much of the red dye is dissipated as to how many of the cells have died, and that gives you a good indication of the toxicity of a drug before you go and do your microdosing of the human trials, which is a step that every drug will go through.
Quite a lot of scientists would say that we actually need to test on animals to make medical advances and to prevent human suffering and disease. What's your response to that?
Well, there's a lot of scientists that say the opposite, and I've got a science degree myself. I'm not coming out of this ignorant of the scientific method and how science works. And there are a lot of doctors and scientists saying this now. I mean, a classic example was a paper that was published at the start of this year looking at sepsis drugs developed in the US, and the researchers were looking at why is every one of the 150 drugs that have been developed in the last couple of decades failed when it hits humans, when it's fine for treating it in mice. So they went back and they looked at the model of mice and they saw that, well, the genes that have been activated in the mice when they've got sepsis, and that's what they've been targeting their treatments on, when those same corresponding genes in humans are actually suppressed when the sepsis hits them. So all the drugs that were working in the mice, as soon as they hit the humans, they just failed. And this is a big deal. Sepsis is the biggest killer of patients in the intensive care units in the US, nationwide. And billions of dollars have gone into researching this, and not one successful treatment has come out of these trials.
So basically, animals are suffering a lot to produce no accurate result in that case.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the researchers that have been doing this work have seen the stuff that was published at the start of this year and have gone, we need to really reassess our whole basic method. We need to look at how these, take the cells from the patients who've actually got the disease, as opposed to trying to mimic the disease in a mouse in a lab. And that's, and they're saying that we've got to remember that they're treating humans, they're not treating mice, and they've got to change a lot of their basic methodology. It's just a shame it took 2 decades of constant failures for them to...
And animal suffering.
Yeah, when there are other doctors that have been saying this stuff for decades. But, yeah.
And what sort of legal protections are there for animals in New Zealand? Are there limits on how animals can be tested? Is the law good enough?
The Animal Welfare Act is what covers the treatment of animals in New Zealand. And Part 6 of that relates to research, testing and teaching, and that Part 6 is basically an exemption for anyone that uses animals for those reasons. The rest of the Act doesn't apply to them. The only oversight we've got are the ethics committee system and how that's run here, but that's self-regulatory, and it's there's no public public transparency going on there. We've got ethics committees that have been established by the private companies that are making the money from doing the testing, and they're meant to provide the oversight and see whether this testing is actually necessary. We've seen paperwork showing that the person who's the chair of a private company's ethics committee is also the director of the company that's directly profiting from carrying out these tests, and they're the person that's approving whether these trials will happen.
Sounds like a conflict of interest to me.
Yeah, I mean, and that example is heightened by the fact that they were in a personal relationship as well. The head researcher for the company, the director of the company, who was also the head of the ethics committee, were in a personal relationship. There's all sorts of conflicts of interest in there, but there's no transparency. I mean, the NZ has been trying to get hold of copies of minutes from the ethics committee's meetings for over 20 years now, since these things started happening, and they're just not released. There's no transparency going on there. We're relying on them to regulate themselves, and there's no interest for them to be doing that.
And do companies keep testing on animals basically because it's cheaper? Is that...
That's definitely a factor in some cases. Going back to the toxicology testing stuff that we've been looking at recently in relation to the party pills testing, the indication we've had is that the animal testing is about 1/3 of the cost of the non-animal testing. So when you've got a government compelling a private company to do testing and submit the results to the government, the private company is going to go, okay, we can do this one for 1/3 of the cost of this one. The results are nowhere near as accurate, but it's 1/3 of the cost. And when these companies are motivated, primarily, bottom line, is money, they're going to pick the cheapest one, not the best one.
And would it be feasible to outright ban testing on animals in New Zealand?
Yeah, it needs to happen. And the example of the sepsis is showing that this continued reliance on animal testing is harmful to both the population and the animals that are suffering for no reason for this testing. There'll be people crying up saying, oh, we can't just outright end it because people will suffer. Well, people are suffering now, and people are suffering because the medical research isn't getting the results it should be. They're brilliant at curing cancer in mice, but not so good at curing cancer in people, and that's because all the research is focused on curing cancer in mice. You're looking at artificially induced diseases in animals and then trying to transfer those results to a different species where the diseases are occurring naturally for completely different reasons.
Thanks very much, Stephen.
Okay, thank you.
The number of scientific procedures carried out on animals in Britain rose by 8% in 2012, according to figures published by the Home Office. The rise came despite the government's pledge to reduce the use of animals in scientific research. The number of animals used topped 4 million for the first time. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals called the increase alarming and said it was a wake-up call to find ways to reduce the number of animals used in research. The number of non-human primates used in the research rose by 545, an increase of 22%. A defender of the experiments called genetically modified animals the next generation of tools to understand complex conditions such as Parkinson's. She had obviously forgotten that animals are not tools or things but living beings. Springer, an orphan orca repatriated with her pod a decade ago, has had a calf, Canadian biologists said. Springer and her baby were spotted during a survey in waters off British Columbia. Springer, now 13, was captured in 2002 after she was observed alone hanging around ferries and boats. She was fattened up in a net pen before being taken by catamaran to her home pod and released. Biologist John Ford said that he now felt like a father. The social system for orcas is so closed that if Springer had not been taken back to her home pod, she would have been unlikely to have been accepted. The United States Army has implemented a change in policy to ban non-medical personnel from participating in training using animals. Service members were previously allowed to use and kill animals in training. PETA last year exposed a military drill that used live goats with their limbs being broken and cut off. Congress has requested that the Department of Defence submit a detailed plan for the phase-out of all animal use in medical training drills in favour of modern, non-animal methods. Now, here are the 5 key points you need to know from this week's episode. Donate money or volunteer your time if you want to help the sanctuary or other animal refuges around New Zealand. Check very carefully when buying eggs to ensure that they really are free range. There's a lot of deception in labelling. Hundreds of thousands of New Zealand animals are used in experiments every year. Vivisection is unnecessary nowadays. There are many alternatives to testing on animals. Make retailers and producers aware that you will not buy products tested on animals. That's our program for this week. Join me next week for the final episode in the series. We'll speak to a vet about why dogs bark and how cruel it is to leave dogs home alone all day. We'll also hear why it's important to microchip your animals. And we'll see the latest technology which lets humans watch in on what their animals are doing while the humans are away from home. Thanks for watching. Ka kite anō.